800 million people living in the ruin of the old world.
She has control of everything.
Only one thing fighting for order in the chaos. This is Judge Dredd.
Peachtree's is the manufacturing base for all the Slo-Mo in Mega City 1.
Makes the brain feel as if time is passing at 1% its normal speed. You know how often we get a judge up in Peachtree's?
Well, you got one now.
Somewhere in this block are 2 judges.
Rookie, you ready?
I want him dead.
We're gonna have to go through him.
If we play this right, we can take the whole city.
Final. Judgment time.
Let's finish this.
The sentence is death.
Hi, everyone, and welcome once again to Geekfest Rants. My name is Carlos Barone, and joining me today I have Steve Ivona. Say hi, Steve.
Hey, Carlos.
Today we are going to talk about a movie that was somewhat overlooked last year, including by ourselves. We had done a previous episode where we talked about an overlooked film called Looper, which totally bypassed us altogether, and then we were kicking ourselves in the ass for not watching it, and then we did get around to watching it. We had such a good time doing it. Same situation here. The movie we're talking about today is Dredd, as in Judge Dredd, but this particular version is just plain Dredd. Now, the poster says Dredd 3D. I don't think the movie's called Dredd 3D. I think that's just part of the advertisement for the picture. But it's funny that they worked it into the poster. And this is a retelling, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the second time around they retell the story of Judge Dredd.
Yeah, I'm sure our listeners know that in 1995, Sylvester Stallone did Judge Dredd, and it was not successful. And that was the first live action, any film version of the comic, which is an extremely popular comic in England that's been around since the 70s. But the Stallone version was a failure, to say the least. Being a Stallone fan, I can handle it, but I think that the general population doesn't have much use for it. And it took many, many years for them to reboot it, so to speak. And last year, this version that we're talking about now, starring Carl Urban as Judge Dredd, was released. And not only, you talk about the fact that we missed it. I mean, we missed seeing it in the theater, but we knew it was coming. And I personally wanted to see it, but it just eluded me. And one of the reasons it eluded me is because it was such a bomb. Right. Even though it received very, very good reviews.
There was definitely an undercurrent of good reviews.
Yeah.
Not that reviewers were screaming at the top of your head, this is the movie you got to watch this year, but it just had this very low rumbling build of somewhat of a good reputation, especially from the genre community, the sci-fi comic book geek community.
Right. And I was about to say that. I mean, the mainstream media wasn't gushing over it, but definitely the genre press and the people that we listen to were singing its praises, and I, for one, was very eager for it. Whereas Looper was something that I just kind of missed the boat on, really wasn't paying attention to, and it was gone before I knew it. But Dredd, I really had a sense of, I want to see this movie. And it came and went, and I still cannot fathom why it did so poorly.
Yes, definitely. Now, to compare it to other films, I would kind of say, to me, it's a little bit kind of like, not in terms of story, but in terms of impact. To me, it's kind of like Robocop, the original Robocop.
Okay.
A movie that at first I was like, come on, how are you going to pull this off? It's kind of suit and it's kind of cheesy looking a little bit.
Right.
And this one, it has the baggage of the previous film. And we've talked about this before on a show we did about reboots and remakes.
Yeah.
And that is, why would somebody bother to make a remake of a movie that was a bomb, in theory? You know, it was a bad movie. Why would you want to rehash a bad movie? And even when there were, you know, the pictures would leak out of, oh, that's the lead character wearing the helmet, it's like, okay, yeah, I mean, I get it. I get it. All right. You know, just like yourself, you know, I'm not a big comic book fan in terms of this particular comic book and just, I mean, in my case, comic books in general.
Right.
So, you know, I was aware that there were, you know, there is a following with this character, and I'm sure there's, you know, super fans, you know, dedicate their life to this character. But to me, that wasn't strong enough of an appeal to jump on the bandwagon. And after seeing it, to me, it's kind of like Robocop in terms of, wow, talk about a movie that it's just more than a cartoon or a comic book. This is a real strong, you know, character development type of film.
Yeah. You know, it's funny, before you mentioned Robocop, I wouldn't have thought that, but definitely the main characters have that sort of single-minded purpose of this is what they're supposed to do. In Robocop's case, he's programmed to do it. In Judge Dredd's case, you know, it's just he believes in the law, and you know, to be a judge, you have to be this kind of almost like a robot.
Right.
But yet there is a character there. There's a personality there. And you see that most when he's bouncing off the judge that he's training throughout the film. And there's definitely more to the character, more under the surface that you might think. And just to get back to what you said about why, you know, why do this over? I think that in the case of a lot of the more recent reboots that we've seen, there's always this sense that, you know, if it's a popular enough character and they screw it up the first time, well, then they'll give it a second chance. I mean, 15 years, 16, 17 years is a long time between reboots or whatever, however you want to say it. You know, nowadays it happens much quicker, and we pointed that out in the earlier show. You know, stuff like the Hulk and Superman, you know, those are coming fast and furious, the reboots, when they mess up. And, you know, I guess that Dredd is just, it's a much more of a cultish popularity that he has, not as mainstream as, you know, like the Marvel superheroes. And it took longer to get this off the ground. But, you know, it definitely was a slow burn. And there was always this thinking that, you know, they messed it up the first time. Stallone messed it up. The studio messed it up. You know, they just like with almost every other misfire of a comic book character, they stray too far from the source material, and this is what happens.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the story itself, because once again, when we compare it to the previous version of Judge Dredd, this story is a little more compact in terms of the scope that it covers.
Right.
The original story gives you the character, not too much of his background, his interaction with new people, you know, new rookie type of people, and his interactions with the whole society and his interactions with the judge system itself and how corrupt it can be and manipulative and all that stuff. Here, they kind of focus a little more on his introduction to a new rookie.
Right.
And they do touch upon the potential corruptiveness of judges, but I don't think they're as big as they did it on the previous film. I think here they're hopefully trying to save that whole thing for hopefully future films.
Well, definitely. You know, the Judge Dredd story, it's like all these other stories of the comic characters. He's been around for 30, 35 years. There's a wealth of material that they can pull from. You're right. The Stallone movie, they did try to bring in elements of the comic that this movie didn't even bother with. And I think to its credit, yeah, you were right. It told a much more compact story. There were things that it just briefly touched upon, but that it was just, you know, plot points that they needed to get through. Yes, there's corruption. And how do we know there's corruption? Because there were corrupt judges who went after them. When the mama, the drug dealer, called them in and said, you know, get rid of these guys.
Well, let's try to hit the story a little bit so our listeners can understand. It's the future, you know, the post-apocalyptic looking future as usual. And society is just a mess in terms of crime is just through the roof. So they kind of cordon off sections of the cities of the country by making these like hamlets of areas that are controlled and patrolled by judges.
Right.
Now, these are judges that are a combination of cop, you know, enforcers,
they're judges,
executioners. It's the whole spiel rolled up into one person.
Right.
And, you know, obviously these are not wimpy characters. These are tough characters. And in this particular film, they're pairing up an old veteran judge with somewhat of a reputation for being a hard ass with a new rookie that happens to have these kind of psychic powers almost.
Yeah.
Now, is this something that's new, psychic powers to the story, or this is pretty
of the comic? Now, I should just preface what I'm about to say by saying, as much as I would probably enjoy the character, enjoy the comic, I've never read it. I've only read bits and pieces, usually when they've crossed over with mainstream superheroes like Judge Dredd, Batman, and things like that. I only have a very sort of basic knowledge of the character. But from everything I've read, the story was very faithful to the character as he's originally portrayed. And yes, psychic abilities are definitely part of the landscape there. And their country, there's been a nuclear war, and certain areas have been divided into these megacities, and the rest of the country is called the Cursed Earth. That's where, it's like a no man's land where anything goes. But in these megacities, the judges control it just seems as if they're hanging on by a thread. And, even though the judges are out there doing their thing, there's a lot of corruption and crime and all that kind of thing. But the judges are barely sort of holding the line on that. And Judge Dredd is like the guy. He's like the number one judge, and he's the toughest, and he's the lead badass.
Right. And what is driving the bad guy, you need some kind of driving element here, is apparently this new drug that is called Slo-Mo, which ironically has a slow motion type of effect in the way that, the audience is allowed to view what happens when people take this drug. Now, to do this is something very visually striking for the film that they've done, and that is they create this ethereal slow-mo effect where everything is super sharp, but it's also kind of cloudy at the same time.
Right.
And things move at a different speed. I don't want to say it's kind of like a Matrixy effect, but in terms of it being different, it's not just slow motion. They do a lot of tricks with this slow-mo thing. Now, we didn't see it in 3D. This is a 3D film, and apparently it was shot specifically in 3D so that they could take advantage of some of these effects. And I bought it on Blu Ray, which apparently the only way that it was available in Blu Ray was in the 3D Blu Ray version that you could watch in either way, but there is no 3D or Blu Ray version. It's a combo pack.
Okay.
And I only watched it in regular form, in regular Blu Ray standard 2D form.
Yeah.
And it looked really, really cool. I can't wait to be able to pop it in a 3D player at some point in the future and watch it in 3D because it looks so cool in the way that they showed it so far. But I can't wait to see the 3D version.
Yeah.
So this drug is when you do get to see most of the effects of the 3D way that this film was shot. And this film is also a little reminiscent. Now, I don't know if it's by accident or by coincidence or on purpose. I have no clue, of another movie we've both seen called The Raid.
The Raid, yeah.
In terms of a plot that involves a loner kind of cop having to flush out a bad guy that is kind of locked himself in a super high rise that is patrolled by a ton of bad guys with a ton of weapons, and he has to work his way up to the top floor, to get the bad guy. This movie kind of has that same kind of theme. They're trapped in this huge, huge building, and they have to kind of work their way to Mama, who is the main bad guy portrayed by the actress
Lena Headey,
who some of you might remember from, and it's funny because I've recently seen her in so many things. 300, Terminator, the Sarah Connor Chronicles.
Right.
And if you guys watch Game of Thrones, she's one of the big bad guys in that show too.
Yeah, she's well known to genre fans.
Yeah, and here she plays she's kind of scarred up and really a nasty character.
Yeah, definitely. And you're right. I mean, I can't imagine. It's almost, I have a hard time believing that one film ripped off the other. I know that Dredd has been in development. This version of Dredd has been in development since like 2007, 2008. So I don't know if there was any sort of stealing or whatever you want to say, but the tone of both films is just so similar. Even though, Dredd is a genre film and Raid is a sort of straight up action film.
Right. It's a chopsaki kung fu type of modern
slash action, slash Asian action film.
But I couldn't tell you that, forget this film, watch this one. I would say watch both of them.
Oh, yeah,
they're both
absolutely.
Equally great films.
Yeah, no, without question. And it's funny because The Raid also got terrific reviews. I mean, it doesn't have the kind of distribution that Dedd received in this country, but...
Right, but it's more of a foreign film. It's an Asian film. This is, technically, you could kind of say this is a foreign film because it's South African, I believe.
Well, yeah, it was shot in South Africa, yeah.
Now, let's talk a little bit about some of the actors. Carl Urban. Where do we know him best from?
Talk about genre credits. I mean, he's Lord of the Rings, Star Trek, those are the two biggies. And he's made his mark with both. And, I think he's one of the brighter spots in the Star Trek reboot. He's great as Dr. McCoy. The way he channels DeForest Kelley is kind of scary. He's so good.
Now, what would you ever make you think that this guy could play a tough guy?
In Lord of the Rings, he's sort of like a sullen, not like Dedd, but he's definitely got that edge to him. And he's been in some other films that...
I know he played a bad guy in a movie called Priest, which is a sci-fi action film.
A terrible sci-fi action film.
Yes, but he was a pretty creepy bad guy.
Uh-huh.
So that kind of gave me a little bit of a hint that, he can kind of ratchet up if he wants to. Obviously, over the top. Now here, I think it helps. And this is something that I think the fans of Judge Dredd in general like. The fact that he never takes off that helmet.
Right. That's
essential. And I think that if he would have taken off the helmet, my point of view is not so much, it's bad for the fans or it's bad for the truth, or how good you're being, how honest you're being to the story. I think it takes away from the character. It takes away from the myth of this character by having to take off that helmet.
Right. No, and that was Stallone's first mistake with his version. That's the problem when you have somebody like Stallone who, whether or not, whatever you think about how he looks is how he looks. He's not going to hide himself in a mask for a whole movie. But right. Urban, was willing to go there, and that's the character. I mean, the character, to my knowledge, the character in the comic has never shown his face, ever.
Wow.
I mean, maybe little shadows here and there, little glimpses, but never like a full-on, this is what he looks like kind of a thing. And Stallone dropped the helmet probably within the first 20 minutes of the movie, which, again, it was just one of many problems with it.
Now, let me ask you something. I don't know if you know this. Do we get to learn more about the character, or is the character a blank slate always?
No.
The way that I compared it to Robocop is also the fact that with Robocop, you get little bits and pieces of this character, trickled out to you a little bit at a time in one movie. But this seems to be like the kind of character that every now and then they could drop you a little morsel of, oh, that's why he's like this.
Yeah, the comic, and this is what I said before about the Stallone version. The Stallone version threw you a lot more about his background than the new movie. And it was all pretty much straight out of the comic. And, in the 35 or so years that he's been around, they have definitely pulled back the layers of the character and revealed quite a bit. It just goes to show you that there really, there's a lot of material to mine in terms of who this guy is, what makes him tick, his family background, things like that. All of that is touched on in the comic. He's not a blank slate. He does what he does and he is who he is, but he's not this sort of, Dedd is definitely a sort of a multi-dimensional character who has, he just, he's a tough bastard, but, he's still, there's still a lot to learn about him.
Now, do you remember, because I don't remember in the Stallone version, was there any hint of psychic powers with some people having any kind of extra
it's been
sensory
so long,
powers or anything like that?
Since I saw it, I couldn't tell you right off the bat.
Because the character here is called Judge Anderson, played by Olivia Thirlby.
She's from the comic.
Oh, okay,
She's from the comic, and she's not the character that Diane Lane played in the Stallone version. She's out of the comic.
I liked her character because she wasn't like a typical ditzy rookie. She did have her rookie, greenness about her, but right. There was something else in this character that it was like building up. And every now and then she can kind of unleash that, right. Which is kind of cool.
Yeah, I enjoyed her performance very much. She definitely could hold her own with Dedd, with Carl Urban. I thought they played off against each other very well. It's interesting to note, though, that in the film, in this version of Dedd, again, I can't speak to the Stallone version, but in the comic, there's a whole division of cops who have psychic powers. In this movie, she's the only one, she's the only judge to have psychic powers. They make little alterations here and there, but yeah. again, somebody else who I'd like to see in a sequel.
Definitely, definitely. Well, one of the things that they mentioned on the internet is that there might have been some post-production problems with the film that actually led to the director not being involved in some of the post-production. You know, him having some kind of disagreements with the producers or something. And it's funny because when something like that happens, usually it results in something looking weird in the film. Like the best example to me comes to a movie like Alien 3, where apparently there were so many problems between the studio and the director, David Fincher, that Fincher completely, you know, tried to write himself out of that movie as much as possible. But here, you know, apparently the writer of the film ended up being very involved in the post-production to the point where I think he almost tried to get some directorial credit or something like that. But, you know, as far as I can tell from viewing the film, I don't notice any, you know, that doesn't come out. No. You know, it doesn't show on screen, thank God.
No, it's absolutely seamless. The tone, the pacing, the editing, everything, the visuals, it all flows very well. And again, you know, I think the proof is in the reviews. That's usually something that critics jump right on when it's obvious, you know, when they've kind of tinkered with the movie after the fact or done reshoots.
They'll say, looks like something got screwed up here or there, but no, that never popped up as far as I was able to tell by watching the film. The other thing I really loved about the film was the music. The composer was Paul Leonard-Morgan, and it's a very futuristic, you know, very percussion type of score that it's, you know, it's one of those scores that it's like, it's rare for me to be able to say, whoa, to notice a score that stands out. And this one definitely stood out.
Right. When we talk about this movie, I'm just still baffled at why it did so poorly. I mean, do you have any sort of theory as to why it bombed?
Well, did it come out in the summer or did it come
out in September? Same time Looper.
Well, I imagine that's part of the problem. This type of a movie probably going into when they tried to market it, they probably said, get it away from the summer because all the big boys are going to be in the summer. So let's get it away from that. And whenever you do that, you got to flip a coin because sometimes you get lucky. And by pushing you away from the clutter of the summer, you end up being able to find an audience. Right. In this case, it didn't happen that way.
Right.
They weren't able to do that, which is a shame. I mean, I'm not going to tell you that if they were released it in the summer, it would have done any better.
Sure.
But, you know, a movie like this released 5-10 years ago would have cleaned house. I think we are just completely full of too many potential blockbusters that these type of movies, they just get lost. I mean, what are the odds that Looper and this film that are great films get lost?
No, it's true. And you're right when you say that. I mean, you talk about the summer blockbuster season. It seems to start earlier and earlier and end later and later. You know, now, just for example, in this coming year or this coming blockbuster season, I'd say that the first official release would be Oz. You know, that's coming out in March.
It's spring. Spring is really the beginning now of the blockbuster season.
But March? I mean, April, you would start to, I can remember some movies coming out in April, but now it's earlier. And, they used to say that August was where blockbusters went to die because it was just the end of the summer. Yes. And I think that, if the movie's not a slam dunk, they'll put it out, in September, October, just so they hope it finds an audience. But you're right, it can backfire.
Definitely. It's almost like when you start to see the Christmas advertising in September. Yeah. It's not even Halloween, and you start to see Christmas displays all over the store. You're like, what happened? That's how the summer season now works.
Right. It's crazy, and it's also sad that movies like this don't find an audience because it's obvious that the filmmakers have sequels in mind, and I, for one, would be excited to see one.
Yes.
And it's definitely in jeopardy. I mean, I know there's been talk, because now you talk about worldwide grosses, you talk about Blu Ray and all the other income streams that they have that could determine whether or not this is worth a sequel. I hope it, I hope that.
Well, at this point, it's really up to the home market. Mm-hmm. If enough Blu-rays are sold, I imagine they could potentially greenlight a sequel. And I mean, I know that the creators of the film and stars of the films, they're all for it. I've heard some Urbain interviews that he talks about, how he looks forward to the possibility of continuing the story because he says there's so much to explore with this character,
right?
That he can't wait, but obviously it's going to depend on the money.
Right. Yeah, it's almost like John Carter. That was another one. That's a whole nother conversation, but I liked that film, and I was shocked. I did. I like John Carter. I'll go toe to toe with you on that one in another show. But I was stunned that it, was such a disaster.
Well, that's a different type of movie in terms of that's a movie that the studio was standing behind full tilt.
Yeah.
This is a movie that, the studio did pony up the money, but they kind of buried it too.
Yeah, but this is also not a big studio film. Dedd is not, it was distributed by Lionsgate, and it had all these different European studios behind it. It didn't have a mega budget.
No, not at all. But we definitely recommend it.
Oh, yeah.
I would say rent it, stream it from Netflix, anywhere you can get your hands on it. Watch it because it's, if you have your list of good genre and bad genre, this one's definitely on the good side.
Definitely.
Cool. Well, I'd like to thank Steve for joining me today on this discussion of Dedd.
My pleasure.
And we hope to have you guys join us again soon when we discuss another one of these topics. So on behalf of everyone here, we'd like to thank you for joining us, and we'll see you here next time on Geekfest Rants. Bye-bye, everybody.
Law is not the law. I'm the law.
Stop.